In this episode, I speak with Darren McEnaney of the Seeking I podcast. Like me, he's skeptical, but decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. And, like me, he was pretty astounded by what he learned. This prompted him to launch the Seeking I podcast, which is all about research into the nature of life, death, and whatever comes next. And he speaks with some really fascinating guests on these topics. Note that this is an Instagram Live as well as one of my earliest episodes that I'm now creating and adding the video. So the sound is pretty amateur, so please don't hold that against me. And it's still a great episode. Darren is so fun and so interesting, and we have a wonderful conversation. Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special. Fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@WTFJustHappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. Welcome to What the Fuck Just Happened. I'm your host, Liz Entin. If you listened to the intro, you know my story. If not, here's a brief summary. I'm a sciencey-skeptic, and when my dad died, I took a shot in the dark and decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. I assumed that was as realistic as Santa Claus, but I was desperate. However, I was so blown away by what I discovered that I wrote a book and launched this podcast. In this podcast, I'll be talking to some fairly normal people about some really weird shit. I speak with everyone from psychic mediums and afterlife researchers to ordinary people who've had some inexplicable experiences. So come, listen. There's no need to draw any final conclusions. Keep an open mind and wonder, what the fuck just happened? So welcome everyone. I am here with Darren. I keep calling you Darren Mac because when I first met you, that's what you were going by, and that's engraved in my name. So I'm going to ask you to properly introduce yourself because, is it Mac? I'm going to mispronounce it, so please introduce yourself.
Don't worry about it. My name's Darren McEnaney. It's an Irish name. It's difficult to pronounce. No one ever gets it right. I'm effectively just a lay researcher of consciousness and life after death. I was like you. I was a skeptic to begin with. I'll say skeptic. I just never really believed anything was true about any kind of life after death or consciousness beyond the brain until I started looking at it through necessity, from depression and anxiety caused by a fear of death. And having started looking into it, I effectively changed my mind on it. Because, as I say, previously I'd never had the need to look into this stuff. So I just took it for granted that it must be all bunk. But when I started looking into it and talking to the experts for my own podcast, you start to realise that you can't have opinions on these sort of things if you're not overly familiar with the research and the science done on it.
Yeah, so if anyone follows me, you probably can tell that's pretty familiar to my story. I mean, the source was different of what made me explore. So you guys know, unfortunately, my dad died. But
I noticed that Darren and I had a similar path in that we assumed this was absolutely not true. And then we're absolutely shocked. So, Darren, do you mind? I was actually listening to your YouTube about it last night. Do you mind sharing a little what was the first steps you took that made you explore this? Very first book you opened, or the first thought you had that made you think, wow, maybe there really is something else?
It's difficult to gauge because I've been doing it for so long. I mean, I started looking at it originally when I was 12. I'm 25 now, so 13 years ago. And that came, I say, as a result of I experienced a traumatic event when I fainted in a science lesson, and that, for some reason, triggered off anxiety and depression, focused around a fear of death. What I did to begin looking at it after that is difficult to remember. I think the near-death experience was the first thing I found because it was the most common, the most popular kind of thing at that time in relation to it. Hi, Andrew, by the way. Sean from Seeking I came over and said, joined up. So when I first looked at it, it was I think, the near-death experience because it was kind of a culturally interesting subject and it was everywhere. But when I started looking at it, the first thing I thought was, hallucination, dying brain. Even at 12, I was aware that can be nothing but just a hallucination. But I read a few and I found them interesting because they were all so similar. And my first thought was, well, if it is a hallucination, it's a very persistent one, a very similar one that everyone is experiencing the same thing. And that kind of garnered interest a little bit more, but I didn't think much of it until I came across veridical perception in near-death experiences where people who are in a situation where they're effectively brain dead, especially during cardiac arrest, are able to see things and report back accurately. Things they see either in the near vicinity, in the operating room or the recovery room, or outside of their immediate area in other hospital rooms or sometimes other countries in some instances. And that really did kind of garner a lot more interest because now it seemed to have an empirical basis to it. I didn't have the language to understand what that meant back then, but it did really pique my interest.
Yeah. And I'm so sorry, Dan, to do this. Do you mind maybe talking a little more into the microphone? I don't know if everyone else is hearing, but it seems to work on Instagram Live, but through the podcast, I'm not hearing you. Yeah, through the podcast equipment, I'm having a really hard time hearing myself. Okay,
I'll plant this right in front of my mouth like this.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. And all of you guys are getting the insight to behind the scenes of making a podcast. So
yeah,
usually we don't have an audience with all the technical stuff. But if anyone's interested in making one, you're getting a bit of the behind the scenes of things can get a little glitchy sometimes. So yeah, near-death experiences, that. And I also know from what I was listening to yesterday at first and what you were saying that it seems like it's just initially, it's just your brain, like your brain coping with terror of death, with the trauma, with physical pain, maybe depending, like you're going to make up some story to get through it. But then I know you were saying there were a few ones that there was actually evidence behind, and that was pretty shocking. I know that for me, I actually remember hearing about near-death experiences when I was about 12 or 13, and I, just had this twinge of, oh my God, could this possibly be true? And I asked my mom, and my mom's a therapist, and she works with neuroscientists, and remember she said, this is really interesting. And then she was like, yeah, well, like the next day or next week, she said she asked some of the neuroscientists she worked with, and they laughed and were just like, oh, this is just a bunch of nonsense. It's brain making sense of trauma. And that was, very much my upbringing. So I didn't hear about them until my late 20s after my dad died. And I started reading again and I was pretty amazed, So was there one you read about that you were just like, this is life changing, or this makes me change my perspective?
The one that really sticks out in mind, and it wasn't until later, was the Pam Reynolds case, the famous one.
Oh, God.
Because that had so much medical data surrounding the timing and everything in association with what was taking place in the procedure, and the procedure itself was such an invasive thing, that required, by definition, the brain to be drained completely of blood and frozen effectively, that you'd think no way whatsoever any perception should take place. Now there is debate on when the experiences took place as opposed to, or in relation to when the brain was completely drained. A lot of the perceptions took place while she was under heavy anesthesia, but the brain was still, it still had blood and it still was functioning. However, throughout the whole procedure, the EEG was measured, and it was flat throughout the time the perceptions took place. And we know that because the EEG was being monitored 24/7 throughout the whole procedure, as was necessary. And that was, as Andrew just said, is contested famously by Dr. Gerald Verley, who is of the opinion that it was all very much explainable physically. And, that's the importance of looking at both sides of these sort of things, because, when I was first introduced to the case, and even now, I'm not fully confident with the entire details of the case, which is why I look to the experts who have researched it in depth on both sides. There's a guy I know, I won't mention his name because he doesn't like to show himself much online, who's a researcher who's gone extensively into the case, and I spoke to him, asking about the details, and also Gerald Verley, who's also done very extensive research on the case but has come to the other conclusion. And you bring them together, mention to each other's arguments, and then compare what they say. And to me, that case remains probably one of the strongest, because simply of the way you can collate the medical records and the EEG measurements with the times that the experience took place and what was seen and what was confirmed.
Yeah. And my thought on debunking, I feel there's a preponderance of very, very strong evidence of an afterlife, and there isn't concrete proof. There just never will be, and there can't be, as far as I know. When I really think about things, there isn't proof of almost anything, because you can always have an alternate conclusion. And I feel very often the quote-unquote debunkers are just offering another theory of very complicated, inexplicable, go against physics as we understand it, experiences. And you could make up, I don't want to say make up, because very often it sounds like they draw logical conclusions, but I would, kind of take that, I don't want to say not take it seriously, because I always think, putting together theories is something that, for the most part, minus some absurdities, should always be at least listened to and respected, because it's how people are putting together information. That's a very important thing to do as a human, to process information, to think about it. But, you can, when you start putting them all together with the evidence behind them, that's when I'm like, well, maybe one set of debunking or materialist conclusion works for this specific case, but then how did they explain the next one, and then the next one, and then you see that, this is my opinion, you see that the debunking, or even a less degrading word like materialist conclusion behind all these, don't seem to have a common thread, but the non-local consciousness begins to have a common thread. For example, recently, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is a near-death experience researcher through Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, and that was one of the people who got me to first really consider something's going on with NDEs. He has a story where, he was a brand new doctor. He was a psychiatrist, traditional materialist, and a woman, I believe, she had attempted suicide, and he was a new doctor, wanted to be really professional. He had this big spaghetti stain on his tie. And he was so embarrassed, and he was alone in a room when he discovered it, and he hid it. I mean, so no one could see it. And he goes into this woman who's unconscious. And I might have like a small detail wrong, so don't hold that against me if you read it. But I believe when she came out of her coma the next day, I mean, he was in a clean outfit. She commented about seeing him in the other room trying to hide the spaghetti sauce stain. And again, if it was just those two cases, I would be, a lot more inclined to stick with the materialist conclusions. But there's hundreds, and I mean, probably thousands and thousands. And one thing I find really interesting is I spend a lot of time reading all the cases. But since I've started, like, quote unquote, coming out of the closet, that I'm really interested in this stuff, there's so many just ordinary people I meet that don't spend their time on this. They're just doing normal jobs, normal life. And a lot of them are like, oh yeah, I never told anyone, but I had an NDE, or my mom did, or my best friend did. And, they don't talk about it. So I think it's so much more prevalent than we realize. And the one common thread through them all seems to be a non-materialist explanation. That's what I think. What do you think, Darren?
I think going back to what you said about proof is an important point to make. A lot of people will ask for proof of life after death, or evidence, or whatever else. And as soon as you hear that, you need to be cautious, because any scientist will tell you that science doesn't deal with proof. It never has, and it shouldn't. Proof is, mathematics. Science only deals with strong or weak evidence and the most likely explanation for a certain set of data. That's what a theory is. It's the most plausible explanation to a phenomena that's measured. It's why, the theory of evolution is the leading theory, because it is so strong with the evidence to support it. That's the other thing, when people say it's just a theory, it's not true, it's not a fact. No, it's not a fact, but a theory is the highest level of scientific accuracy you can get, The debunkers, immediately there's a red flag, because the term debunk implies that there must be bunk to show. And 9 times out of 10, what I've seen with people who are vocally opposed to this sort of thing is that they work off their common sense based on what they've understood throughout their other experiences and their other research into different areas. A good example that I always use is Neil deGrasse Tyson.
You always use what? Sorry?
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Right.
Very smart guy, a very brilliant astrophysicist. And he gave his opinion on near-death experiences. And no matter how smart the guy...
Wait, Neil deGrasse Tyson gave a talk on near-death experiences?
Not a talk as such. He just gave a small piece on his thoughts about it. Just a clip. And it just highlights an example that, doesn't matter how... on his thoughts about it. Just a clip. And it just highlights an example that, doesn't matter how intelligent generally you are on a specific subject. The way he talked about it, you could tell he's never dived into the literature of it deep enough to get a full context overview of the science that's been done on it. And it seems to be the same with a lot of these debunkers, that they're basing their opinions off of their common sense from their own areas of expertise, which is fair enough, but unfortunately, you can't talk with such confidence on the subject if you haven't done complex research into it and looked at the data, talked to the people that collected the data and their ideas, and really, really dived into the subject itself. I mean, I'm generally quite an intelligent guy. I'm good with psychology. I'm good with near-death experiences and things like that. But just because I'm intelligent, don't ask me to tell you how a washing machine works, because I haven't got a clue. So, an intelligence in one area doesn't imply that you have knowledge of any other specialist subject, which is why a lot of these opinions come from, especially online, where it's a very almost a fundamentalist kind of view on this sort of thing come from sharing and watching videos of people who, although are brilliant scientists, have never looked at the research, and assuming that they must be correct simply because of their credentials outside of near-death studies. And unfortunately, the experts that you should go to with this kind of research is those who have spent the last 30, 40, 50 years studying specifically the subjects you're looking at. Jan Holden, Bruce Grayson, Raymond Moody, Michael Sabom, all these people who have specifically, and that's why I have a lot of respect, although I disagree with what he says generally, and there is contention as to his motives. I don't know, but I have a lot of respect for Gerald Verley and his opinions, because he has done the work and he has spent the time reading over the case, specifically the Pam Reynolds and the dentures case. He has put the work in, and he is very familiar with the background of it. So I would much rather listen to his opinion on it than say Dr. What did I say? Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who although has an educated opinion on his common sense from his work in other areas of science, doesn't have that specific knowledge of the subject at hand.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. How can you really know something until you specifically dive into it? People could be brilliant at one thing. And, oh, sorry, yes, anomalous noises. Yes, I just knocked over my cup. Sorry about that. They've stopped, right? Are you hearing more anomalous noises? That was not a ghost. That wasn't anything interesting other than me just being absolutely clumsy in the middle of trying to run a professional podcast. Yeah, I'm not going to take any interesting spiritual PK credit for that. So, but I agree. Lloyd Arbach, yes, Lloyd has been a big influence in my life. Yes, I will call Lloyd Arbach and say my hand moved a cup. But yeah, but regarding that, like I just said that jokingly, but that's why the reasons it's called a hard problem of consciousness. I just think something like consciousness, you can't, in so many ways, understand something so complex or even claim to understand it, because they are baffled still at how brain neurons, which really is a material mass or matter, even creates consciousness. That doesn't make any more sense than the theory that consciousness is non-local and stored in a bank somewhere, downloaded by a brain. And to me, I guess one thing I think about a lot related to consciousness in a brain, I tend to think if it was purely materialist, it might just be very survival based. Concerns about getting food, not that we don't have those as basic concerns, but the human experience is so much more complex than that. Yes, we have our survival instincts, but we even put them to the side for things that are a more deeper spiritual meaning, or not even spiritual, but I'm just talking about, love, for example, it's not survivalistly convenient to give away your money to causes, or, right now my cat just jumped up here. My life would be easier without my cat in terms of survival, or my dog. They're pains, and I have to use my money to take care of them, and I have to interrupt my survival work to walk them. And, but love is more important. And, helping causes I care about that, might absolutely not affect me. And many people feel that and inconvenience themselves and put themselves at risk, or, but love, for example, really does feel like one of the most powerful emotions. And in many ways, roasting my animals. Yes, I'm roasting them, and they heard me. They forgave me, I hope. At least they will when they get their dinner tonight. it's just, there's nothing survival or the way brain neurons would put together the need to exist in a material planet. It just seems so much more, to have much more depth and complexity than only evolution. And I just need to give a disclaimer. I think people who follow this also know I'm pretty much an atheist. I guess I'd say an evidentialist, and I haven't seen evidence of a God. I absolutely respect anyone's belief system. Please don't take that wrong. Just my approach is not about belief. And so when I say we're more than Darwinian evolution, I tend to think, I know we touched upon evolution in the beginning. I tend to think evolution is I don't want to say it's the answer, because I think some things are, how do we know we weren't created through a video simulation, the way some physicists talk about? But I think it makes the most sense of any explanation I've heard so far, and going down that path is going to most likely give us the right answers, and it most likely has a portion of the truth. I just never want to say ever that something so complicated could be the final answer.
Mm.
So I guess that's just sort of that.
It certainly sets the correct foundations as far as I can see with the terms of the evidence, but it is, the theory of evolution does have holes in it that need to be adjusted and refined. But I think following that line of reasoning is going to be the...
Oh, wait, can you pause 1 second for the ambulances? Because for the podcast, I don't want to have to edit out. I feel like you're about to say something really interesting. And one of the...
Just sounds like it's gone. But,
okay.
I think
you can go now. The loud ambulance is gone. I'm in New York City, that's what. So there's going to be traffic.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry.
We never really have it. But yeah, following the line of reasoning that the theory of evolution provides, I think is going to be the most accurate way of determining where the human animal really came from, as opposed to a creationist route, for instance. Because the evidence is so strong for it, that doesn't mean it's complete as we understand it now. There are holes, there are things that are wrong. And it's now just a case of refining it to fit new or adjustable evidence that comes. But going back to the brain being fundamentally neurons, which further fundamentally are matter, particles, quarks, what have you. Good example of why that seems such a difficult thing to quantify of creating consciousness is a good example from Bernardo Kastrup, who as an analogy, states that, if we consider the brain being what it is, effectively a binary system of on and off switches, action potential or no action potential, we can look at it as the same way as taps and pipes and pressure valves. I don't know if you've come across this one, but effectively, if you have a series of taps and pipes, and you were able to match that to the complexity of a neuronal, mass in the brain, and you were able to exactly map the brain in terms of pipes and water valves and taps, you'd be saying that system, it might be as big as the planet, but you'd be able to make that system conscious just by turning on some taps in a certain order. And does that seem reasonable to say that if you were to turn these taps on in a specific orientation, knowing that it's just taps and water, could you then reasonably say that would become conscious when it becomes complex enough? And to me, that's a good thought experiment, because from anyone's common sense, you'd think that no, taps and water can't be conscious, just depending if they're switched on or not. And that is effectively what the brain is. It's just neurons firing or not firing electrical impulses, all of which are matter, non-conscious matter, by their very foundations. So the question is, and every piece of evidence that's ever been used for the theory that the brain generates consciousness is correlatory, which means that a conscious experience takes place and a certain part of the brain lights up. And because it's consistent with certain areas of the brain lighting up under certain conditions of consciousness, it's assumed that is a causational link. Of course, you've got the old correlation does not imply causation, But the problem is, because we don't have a mechanism as to how consciousness could exist without the brain, because it's never been, measurably observed to take place, which to me it has with third-party veridical perception and things like that. Because it's not been accepted, it's seen as a lot less likely in magical thinking. But my argument for that is, well, fine, we don't have a mechanism as to how consciousness could exist mechanistically beyond the brain, nor do we have a mechanism as to how it could be generated by non-conscious matter. And the same evidence, correlationary, can be used for both explanations. It's just to accept that we don't have the mechanism of how the brain can create it, and you immediately have an equal strength theory. But I think just the way the culture is and has developed, it's seen that it must be the case that the brain creates it, even though the evidence is not stronger. And in my belief, the evidence is stronger for a receiver filter kind of theory, because we have these anomalous experiences of consciousness which cannot be explained outside of saying it's all illusion and delusion or lies. And the evidence is there for me to say that it's more likely, more parsimonious, to say that the brain receives consciousness and filters it and translates it in a certain way that allows us to experience life as it currently is. There is a third option, of course, which is the idealist perspective, that consciousness, or the brain, isn't the image of consciousness in a physical form. Same way that, I suppose, combustion, the process of combustion is fire in physical form. The fire is the image of combustion. But looking at physical and non-physical kind of overlaps. And it does get very convoluted, but it gets to the point where once you get these kind of visual examples of taps and pipes, you start to think, that's true. I've never really thought of it, but you've always taken it as the assumption that the scientists understand that the brain does create consciousness, although there's no reason to outside of correlation and cultural kind of implications.
So, I have a question, because I noticed this with myself and a lot of people that tend to be really skeptical, but use that skepticism or, to really examine the evidence of afterlife, non-local consciousness, all things. I don't like the word paranormal, but I don't really have a better word at this point. This was my process, and this seems to be pretty much across the board. So I'm curious if you had this too. It's like you step in and you're blown away and you're like, wow, there seems to be something going on here. But there's this whole stage in the beginning where you're like, oh, I'm sure this can't be true. This sounds amazing, but... And then something happens that's kind of a turning point where you're fairly shocked and you're like, this really seems to be something. I mean, that doesn't mean you conclude it. It's a very long, maybe lifelong investigation. But did you have something like that? Like your turning point?
I would never have looked at the subject further if I didn't have that experience of fainting, which led to the anxiety and the depression. I had a breakdown at 16, became suicidal, and I think getting to that point where you reach the very bottom where you're willing to take your own life to get out of having to cope with it, I think after that it forces you into I suppose looking for meaning, and it can become dangerous, because then you've got a natural bias that takes over for wanting something to be true. And especially with me, with the fear of death, I wanted to find evidence to support the idea that it doesn't, even though I didn't, or to support the idea that the brain or that consciousness doesn't end at death. And of course, there is the danger there that you're going to be very subject to confirmation bias. But as I say, before then, I took it for granted that once we die, that's it, and there's no reason to think otherwise. I think a lot of people who think like that have never had some reason to really push themselves into it. and it's just, as I say, taken for granted. But most people who do believe in this sort of thing have done so out of necessity through some sort of traumatic event or some sort of any event that pushed them as the necessity to do so. A lot of people, I think, especially at our age, never need to think about it. And not until they become older and that becomes a much more impending situation that it really does force you to begin to look at it. So for me, yeah, that was the turning point, was as my anxiety developed and it started really focusing around the fear of death.
Yeah. I know you said sometimes kind of we go into this based on the necessity. And this is one thing that sometimes worries me, because it was necessity. I mean, I was that level of depression too. Mine based on grief, after the loss of my dad, just feeling like, how do I even live in this world without my dad? Like, what's the point? And, I'm going to lose my mom at some point too. And, hopefully I'll have children one day, meet someone, but I'm going to, they're going to just turn around and lose me, or maybe I'd lose them, who knows? We're all going to lose each other. And sort of, what is the point? And like, how do you go on with just knowing everyone you love you're going to lose? So sometimes I guess a worry for me, and I mean, I know I'll share kind of my answer to my own question, but I'll have you go first. Why do you think you're not lying to yourself? I mean, there is a part of our brain that, you can only process so much, and sometimes your brain will give you survival, like psychologically survival answers to things, I mean, this isn't a neutral investigation. How do you know your brain isn't just, or, your unconscious, whatever the word is, my mom is a psychoanalytic therapist, would say it's your unconscious telling you a story and putting the evidence together in a way so you can function. How do you know you're not doing that? What's your thoughts on that?
It would be very easy for that to be true if I focus mainly on the subjective aspects of these phenomena. And I see it a lot. For instance, on a lot of Facebook groups focused around this sort of thing, deathbed visions and not even that, but after death communication, things like that, and people posting pictures saying, I've captured my deceased son on camera, and they circle a part of the picture and you look at it and there's nothing there. And you can tell, this is a matter of, I can't remember what the effect is called, but it is effectively your brain or your mind or whatever telling you that there's evidence there when there isn't, confirmation bias. Which is why, and it could be you could say the same thing for near-death experiences in general that contain only a transpersonal aspect where you go into this new realm and see things and come back, and it's just subjective. I could easily dismiss those as hallucinations or as the dying effect of the dying brain releasing chemicals. And a lot of people take those as accurate, and I can see why, because there's so many of them saying very similar things, but for me it's not enough. And that's why I focus mainly on the empirical based aspects where there are third party verification of perceptions that shouldn't have been able to take place. Because I think with that aspect, unless you really do go beyond the box and say it's all a matter of self-delusion, it's all a matter of people lying, faulty memory, despite having that connection to real life that you can, that is third-party verified. To me, saying that sort of thing is much less likely to be the case than that there is an actual phenomena going on that shouldn't take place with a materialistic background. So I try and eliminate as much bias as possible, though I do acknowledge it's there, by looking only really at the empirical foundations of these experiences and trying to really put them together into a way that would make sense. And I mean, another big part of that is recognising that those sort of biases take place. I'm sorry, there's my little pup outside. Take place also and strongly in the current prevailing paradigm of materialism and the brain produces consciousness. Because again, the idea that the brain produces consciousness is effectively a very baseless kind of assumption based only on based on correlationary information. There's no empirical basis as to how non-conscious matter could create consciousness. But we assume it must happen because of the very tight correlations. But again, you could argue that the brain receiving theory, or even the idealist perspective, which is just as reasonable, is also the case because of the same correlations plus the empirical anomalous experiences that feed into that idea but don't feed into materialism. So it's much more parsimonious. And you see the same biases and the same almost self-delusions, assumptions in the prevailing paradigm. It's just whether you recognise that they are assumptions and not empirically based or not, which unfortunately with the culture and the profitability of material-based science, the encouragement is there to continue that paradigm as opposed to oppose it with new information. You see it all the time where, paranormal, if you want to use that word, research, parapsychological research is extremely underfunded, and you're dissuaded often to pursue it because it's not going to benefit you academically or in a career kind of setting. And as a result, people see it as woo, or certainly not worthy of scientific inquiry. In some cases, it's not even seen as a science, which is unfortunate. So, how do I know that I'm not lying to myself? I don't. But I try to eliminate it as much as possible by focusing only on empirical-based information for these experiences, and by acknowledging that those self-lies or self-delusions, or put it a nicer way, biases, will always exist on both sides of the fence. It's just trying to eliminate them as much as possible and recognizing them when they come up.
Yeah, I feel somewhat similar. Same thing, because people will say you're lying to yourself because you need this to be true. I mean, I've definitely heard that a lot. And I think for me, there's a lot of reasons. Sure, I can read all the books in the world, and that, for me personally, yes, that's been a big part of my conclusion of why I think this is true. But I also have to go just on data and facts that I've personally experienced. I've gotten medium readings. Of course, I want to make things fit, but I'll sit there. I take every precaution, fake names, hide my identity, use a VPN. I mean, just every single thing I can think of. Who knows? Maybe I left something out, but I tried to ask skeptics, and that I really didn't get any good feedback except the generic, basically none of this is true because none of this is true. And I was hoping for something like looking through and saying, wow, I can't figure anything out, or hey, this is a hole you need to fill and fix. But what I do is I get the medium reading, I record it. Of course, each reading's emotional, but I'm careful to not give information. And then it's hard to really know in the moment. So I always listen to the recordings and I make transcripts and I look at each part. Did I say anything? And usually I never say anything other than yes, no. And does this apply? I mean, if someone's getting my dad's name or a specific memory or aspects of his personality, and I can see all the stuff that that they say mediums do to cheat, or give vague information or give 30 names before. Yeah, I mean, have I had readings like that? Sure. Have I had ones that are absolutely inexplicable by normal means? Yes. I've had plenty inexplicable by normal means. And I mean, that just, really all you need is to have had one like that to show that somehow consciousness is behaving non-locally. I mean, granted, if you just have one like that, you probably need to investigate further because, you need to investigate anomalies. And then the other very concrete thing was bending a spoon. I mean, that just I bent a spoon once. I haven't been able to do it another time. And I think something that adds an evidence to that is I have gone to spoon bending events with other people that are more, have psychic abilities than I do. I mean, I really don't. And we would take the same exact spoons, and we were all women about the same size, small, not ones that can just bend metal with our muscles. And it'd be the same spoon. I would try to bend it, and I couldn't, and I'd pass off the exact same one to someone with abilities, and they could bend the same spoon. So the combination of having done it once to that, I mean, that's a very concrete, tangible thing. And really, again, all you need is one time, and I've had multiple. And I trust the researchers too, but again, the strongest thing from my perspective is...
And when you say bending spoons, you don't mean like, bending spoons, you mean like holding it and having it bend?
I mean, I did bend it over, but not like using muscles. I mean, I couldn't using muscles.
So effectively, the metal became a lot more malleable than normal, and it would just go itself effectively with a little bit of force. Yeah.
Yeah, I felt it get really... It was insane. Yeah, I felt it get super hot, like burning hot. It was one of the hottest things I've ever felt, but it didn't hurt. It was a very weird kind of heat. It happened so fast. And then it just was like, I'd been trying to bend it with my muscles before just to test, and I didn't think this was going to work. I mean, I thought if anyone could bend a spoon, it was like this exceptional person with, who needed to be studied in a lab. And yeah, those people who need to be studied in a lab can do it more frequently than me. But it got really hot and suddenly felt really, really soft and just bent over really easily. And then it just cooled off and I couldn't bend it any further. So, I mean, that's pretty tangible. And that's just something that shows that, that the laws of the universe are not exactly how we think they are. And I've had so many multiple things, but I would say the most tangible combined with personal experiences are the scoring I've done on my personal medium ratings and the bending the spoon. And then I'll add about my medium ratings the fact that I've noticed some were really fake too, or not good, or, their hearts might have just absolutely been in the right place, but they weren't evidential. So I think that shows... Again, if you want proof, I can't give you proof. But that is strong evidence that I'm not lying to myself, because I really notice when they're not getting stuff. And I'm, not.
It comes to the white crow analogy, which, if people aren't familiar with it, effectively it's a thought experiment that says, someone can claim that there are no white crows in nature. And that equates to, people can say that there's no paranormal phenomena that takes place in nature. And it only takes someone to find one white crow in the wild for that to be completely, nullified. The problem I find with paranormal stuff is that it seems that people have found these white crows in the wild, but then, the skeptics, they're not skeptics, but the debunkers have then said, well, some old lady went out there with a bucket of paint and just, put some kind of permanent paint on this white crow. It wasn't actually born like that, or some chemical has been put in this white crow, despite it being completely out in the open where nobody exists for miles. And there's always going to be these kind of ad hoc reasoning as to why it can't be the case, no matter how unlikely it is, because of we haven't found one white crow now. We found millions of white crows at this point, but they're all had paint thrown over them, or someone's faked them. So it really is. It's easy to spot these biases when they exist in both areas. I'll give you an example. A guy I know he's a very well-known atheist online. I won't give his name because I don't want to discredit him or whatever. Really, nice enough guy. He's quite formidable with being somewhat angry and somewhat vocal. But I didn't have a problem with him. And he was telling me about an experience he had, where it was an experience of remote viewing, or astral projection, I suppose is what he said. And what happened was, he knew a friend at school, a girl, who could come out of her body and allegedly could get critical information. She said, go home tonight, I'll come and see you tonight outside my body, and I'll describe the room. So what he did, he decided to really put some controls in, which is, good idea. He went to his friend's house to sleep that night. They rearranged the room. They had one bed with two mattresses on it, one bed with one mattress that was higher. They put them in a T shape, so rather than having beds like that, they put them together like that. And the friend already had remember one of the old film movie reel players, where they had the two bits of film on it. The old projector things, don't see them anymore, but he had them in there. And the next morning he went into school. She said, yeah, I came out of my body and I found you. I found you in a room, she said. There was you put the beds in a T shape. One was higher than the other. One had more than one mattress, one had one mattress. And there was a big owl face in the middle of the room. And you can see that because the two reels of film, kind of big eyes and you can see why that would be interpreted that way. Even if you were to dismiss that, having the T-shaped bed, one higher than the other, is pretty phenomenal. And I said to him, because he is very anti all this kind of thing, and he's very vocal that it doesn't happen. I said, well, what did you make of that? Because that's something that happened to you. And he came back and he said, well, since then, the lady who actually came out of her body no longer believes it could have possibly happened, so therefore I don't believe it. You think, that, to me, that really does show a bias, because you can't dismiss that something happened when you experienced it directly and reason that it couldn't have happened because someone else doesn't believe it. Because that doesn't make sense. It happened, you know it happened, and you were part of it. So, to me, that does show an inherent bias there. I dare say that he believed it for good reasons in his mind, but to me, that's a good example of a bias, and one that seems to me detrimental to really trying to look at this stuff empirically.
Yeah. And I found this very interesting because it makes you think what bias means. Like, a lot of times they say it's a personality thing, but there seems to be something in the brain that absolutely does not see things that don't fit into our worldview, which I find fascinating and just makes me wonder. It makes you really think about consciousness, and again, in a certain way, and the brain being a filter, because, I know someone had mentioned Lloyd Auerbach in the comments, and he told a really interesting story where they did a dinner with a group of skeptics. If anyone doesn't know Lloyd Auerbach, he is a parapsychologist and a stage magician, so he knows what to investigate and look for in fraud, and he has concluded definitely that, I don't want to say definitely, but he's concluded he thinks there's an afterlife, paranormal abilities. But so they invited a group of people who were parapsychologists, again, I always feel weird using the word skeptics for this because I consider myself a skeptic, but there's my dog making a lot of noise in the background, sorry, digging in things. They invited a group of ardent deniers that insist none of this is true to a dinner. And I'm just going to wait till my dog's done digging. Okay. So there, he's done digging. So I'm going to repeat that because, again, we're going to have this in the podcast. So a group of parapsychologists invited a bunch of ardent skeptics who insist, obviously, there's no way parapsychology, non-local consciousness could be possible. And what they did, again, I said Lloyd's a stage magician, is they took phenomena that these parapsychologists had seen and experienced and mimicked it in stage magic ways. And it wasn't drastic, like, a light falling out of the ceiling, but it was stuff that could not happen, that they'd experienced. I would love to, at some point, find out exactly what. And the skeptics just didn't see it. They weren't even, it just wasn't even on their radar. They didn't even question it. They literally did not physically see it. And to me, that was, that I just thought that was, is the word interesting? Like, insightful? Like,
there's a very good example of that as well. I can't verify if this is true or not, but it came to me from a guy called Harold Wallach, who's a well-respected scientist. He wrote the Galileo Commission report. If anyone doesn't know what that is, look it up. It's important. And he was telling me about, in the old times, before a heart was recognised as a pump of blood, it was assumed to be a kind of a convection heater in the body. And whenever it was suggested that the heart may be beating, might be a pump, whenever scientists listened to someone's chest, listened to the heart to try and identify a beat, no scientist could hear a beat because they had that predetermined assumption that it cannot be a pump. We know it's already a heater. And no matter how many scientists would listen, they couldn't hear the pump. They couldn't hear a heartbeat. Only when more evidence was given, I suppose theoretically, that it is more likely to be a pump than not, all of a sudden it started to be audible. They could start hearing it because their minds had been opened to the level where they would allow themselves to hear it. And it's just interesting. I don't know how true that is, but that is a very strong example of biases taking place, because now if you listen to anyone's chest, you can hear a heartbeat. And there's no way of dismissing that it's not there or dismissing that it's there, So if that is true, if they couldn't hear a heartbeat by putting their ear up against the chest, how strong must that belief have been for their brain to actively ignore something that's definitely there?
Yeah, and we know our brain just fills in. I mean, it's one of the ways magic works is our brain will fill in stuff that isn't there that should be there already. Or, I think that is we don't see the center of things. Does that have you heard that? Like, this sounds a little weird to explain if you haven't heard it, but physiologically, the way our brains and eyes work, we do not see the center of things, and our brain fills that in. And I've even noticed editing my book, I'm having like a final line editor read it, and I don't know how I did this, and I've worked with a professional editor already. We've read it over a couple times, and which is why I think line editing itself is such a skill. They're just stupid typos, like I've left out ands or buts, and we've read it over, and I think my brain just would literally put those in. I don't even think it was sloppy work because I've been careful. Like, I've literally would see an and when it wasn't there, and so had my content editor, and I think we just do that.
Yeah, in a non-professional setting, I watch a channel which I always find funny, an entertaining called Game Grumps, which is a couple of blokes who just play video games, and I saw a good example of that. That exact thing when they were playing a game, and it was the game had little subtitles that was written in English, but in very broken English, missing a lot of ands, a lot of buts, and just not making sense generally. And as they read out these subtitles in voices for the characters, you can see them adding little buts and little ands when it's not there, because their brains are filling it in to make sense. And it shows if you do that by simply playing a game, how many more everyday life situations do you find that your brain does that, without you noticing that the errors are there. And it is incredible, and it fills in not only when you're reading words or reading books or whatever, it also fills in meaning as well, when there isn't necessarily meaning there. Like, for instance, I can't remember the name of the effect, but as I said, when people post pictures and say that I saw my son, and there's nothing there, but because they are so sure and are so insistent that they want it to be there, I mean, not consciously, but subconsciously they want something to be there, their brain naturally finds patterns. And I can't remember the name of the effect, but it is well known, and it's an example of how you can be so self-deceived. And that's why it's so important that you recognise when the possibility of self-deception comes up. And again, which is why I mainly look at the empirical aspects of the phenomena rather than the subjective ones. I'll give you another good example of that. Have you ever heard of the Peak-Indarian experiences?
The what? Peaking theory of?
Peak-Indarian. Peakndarian. It comes from the Bible, I think, where Darien is the name of a place beyond normal perception, and people can peek into it to see things happen in the future, or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. I've never read the Bible. But effectively, that describes, especially in near-death experiences or deathbed visions, when someone will get a glimpse of somebody, take the near-death experience where they come out of their body and go into this supposed transcendental realm beyond the physical, and they see somebody in heaven or in the afterlife who proclaims they're dead or is reasoned that they're dead because they're there. And when they come back, they confirmed that person died and nobody knew that they'd died. So, for example, one case shows a person who saw, I believe it was their sister, 21 or 18-year-old, very young, and they saw them in the afterlife, and nobody had ever considered that this person might be dead. The sister might be dead because she's so young. They just said goodbye to her on the phone. She went off to university or something like that. And when they came back, he said, I just saw Jill or whatever, and she was in heaven. The parents who were around him at his hospital bed said, we've just said goodbye to her, and if she's just gone, she's fine. But they got a call, I think it was something stupid like 10 minutes or half an hour after that story, that they got a call from the police saying that Jill had just died in a car crash. And it's things like that. That's the Peakindarian experience, where things shouldn't happen. Another example, someone came out of their body and saw a person that they knew was dead. It was his dad or his grandfather, I think it was his father, who had died years before. And he said, I've got a gun. You never knew I had a gun, but I've got a gun, and I hid it down the back of a cabinet in the basement. I want you to go and get it because I don't want your mum to have it. She won't know what to do. She'll panic. So the son, I think it was the son or daughter, woke up, was discharged from hospital and went down to that cellar and found it, as described, wedged behind the cabinet. And they'd never, the son and the mother and nobody else had ever known that he even had a gun, let alone had hidden it down the back there. And that's the example of a Peakindarian that adds a level of empiricism and a level of impossibility that shouldn't take place if none of this exists, if there is no continuation of memory and personality after physical death. And that's another example of white crow phenomena.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting is almost everybody seems to have had varying degrees of these experiences. And I can't tell you how many people, even people who aren't into this, don't believe this. So many people I tell these stories to, or that I'm researching this, and their responses are, well, I don't really believe this, but, and then they share the one or two things that have happened. And I think there's a misconception among the majority of people that if this is true, this is how it's supposed to work. And it's supposed to work as if you're communicating with one material world to another. I can't tell you how many people say, well, if you're talking to mediums, why don't they say, they should be able to hear your dad and have him say, hi, I'm Liz's dad. My name is Richard. My birthday is this. This is our favorite memory. And it's going on a standard as if there's material and using language and have a voice box. And I don't think it needs to be so perfect to say something is happening that does not make sense by a material explanation. And I think that's one of the, maybe problems is the wrong word, but one of the hindrances is, the expectations. Their expectations are such that they're incapable of seeing that something inexplicable is still going on. And I think they could, people can admit that something isn't making sense how it's going on. And that doesn't mean you have to have a definite answer, and maybe let go of the concept of, if this was true, this is how it has to work. And if it doesn't work exactly this way, it's not true.
I've heard a lot of arguments of people saying things like, well, if heaven exists, then there'd be billions and billions of humans and animals, and there'd be no space. Of course, that's assuming that space works in the same way, again here. And also that, people have said, I wouldn't want to live forever. If the afterlife is this eternal realm, it would be horrible to live forever. And I'd say to them, I agree, it would be, but only if you take the assumption that time exists in the same way there as it does here. And, from these cases, it doesn't, not at all. And I hear that a lot, and it does underlie some of these assumptions that are made subconsciously that are so common that you wouldn't think to notice them. And with mediumship, I interviewed a medium who did a reading for me, and she was describing how the process of mediumship works. And it comes often, depends what type of medium you are, if you're clairsentient, clairaudient, whatever else. But for her, because she's clairvoyant, she sees things, and the spirits come through to her. I think she does hear things well, but the spirits come through to her with symbols. And these symbols represent something they want to communicate, but she has to then interpret those symbols in a certain way that is correct for what the message is. And something I pointed out, because I did a video recently where I just had a look at some mediumship readings from John Edward and some other people and just gave my thoughts on it. And I think an issue with people when they analyse mediumship readings is that they automatically equate misses with fraud or bad guesses, whereas the other possibility, which is according to what this medium told me of how she works, is just as likely, is that if they're receiving, and the guy, John Edward especially, even said so himself in the reading, that he's receiving symbols and he has to interpret those symbols in the correct way. Now, because he's human, because other mediums are human, any misses may not be down to fraud or bad guesses or bad cases of cold reading. It could be down to the simple fact that they've misrepresented or misunderstood a symbol that they were given. And I think the example from John Edward one was he saw outer space or something. And he was, if you see stars in outer space, that could mean a huge number of different things. It could mean the person that died likes science fiction, space-based things. The person who's being read likes space-related things. They like Star Trek, they like Star Wars. They've been up to near space in a recreational flight. You don't know. It could mean so many different things. So I think sometimes when things seem to be phishing, it could of course be that it is a case of phishing where they're looking for information to falsify a message. But it could also be that they've got this symbol. They haven't got a clue what the hell it could mean. So they're trying to discern what it means. I don't know if that's the right word, but they're trying to understand what it means by asking and refining what that could possibly mean. So it's difficult. Is it phishing or is it just clarifying?
I think it depends on the medium, and that's why you have to look over the whole reading. I've definitely had ones where no doubt they were phishing, but it wasn't specific, This is, I guess, an example I have. I'll try to give an example of a phishing example versus that, the misinterpretation of the information they're getting is my very first reading, which, oh my God, I'm so lucky. She was so good. And apparently I found out later through one of my friends, someone I've become friends with since in the medium world, that he was like, I can't think of a better medium for you for a first reading. He's like, she's not about the emotion. She's not about spirituality. She's just like, just get proof, just facts, nothing else. And she kept saying what happened on either January 20th or something in the month of December. She's like, I keep getting January 20th. I keep getting January 20th. I was like, I can't think of anything. And my mom had come with me to the reading, although she wouldn't come in the reading room. Just at that point, it was in Long Island, and it was shortly after my dad's death, and I was having too many panic attacks. So I was like, take the train with me. And she, of course, thought this was such bullshit. So she was trying to be nice and was really worried about me, because she's like, Liz is going to be devastated because it's going to be really stupid. And it wasn't, thank God. And she was kind of amazed by that. But so we called her in and we're like, what's January 20th? And my mom's like, I have no idea. And then the woman is like, okay, I just keep seeing 120, January 20th. And we're like, oh my God, 120. That is the building number of our home. And when my dad was in the hospital, not very coherent, he kept saying 120, we've got to go back to 120. Take me back to 120. And So we were just like, holy shit. And the medium's like, see, that's an example. And then, she got stuff about my dad's personality after, because she's like, he's laughing. And he's like, what's wrong with you that it took you so long to get that? And that's, very much his personality. And so that's an example. I mean, how can you be fishing with that? Which is, very different than, probably my worst medium reading, which I'll, if this helps anyone for what to look out for. And I'm knocking her because she's intentionally bad, I would think. I went to a few, one who got nothing, or a few who got nothing. And they, ethically, they said, I don't know why everything I'm getting isn't working. Like, I'm giving you your money back. And others who I could just see were genuinely trying, and maybe were more spiritual minded than fact and evidence minded, and their hearts were totally in the right place, but it wasn't aligned with me, who wants evidence. And they were saying things like, your dad loves you, and I could just tell they were really trying, and they just weren't, which I think a huge majority are that way. But I'd say the worst was, and she was very clearly fishing, because she was going through every single family relation, and she seemed a little uncomfortable that I wasn't giving her information. And she finally I finally had to tell her my dad, and then she's like, oh, he's showing me your mom, and what's this? I'm seeing like a big diamond ring. Did he give her a big diamond ring? Like one in the middle, of two solitaires? And I was like, I mean, that's the most cliche wedding ring. So she kept doing stuff like that, like saying things that were very generic and kind of expecting me to narrow it down for her. And, she was getting pretty upset because I wouldn't do that. And she finally, this is an insight, and maybe, it was pretty upsetting because it was my third reading now. I would just kind of laugh about it. But she then said, I don't understand. What is it you want out of this reading? And I said, I want valid evidence that consciousness could survive a brain, something inexplicable. And she kept saying, it's so interesting that you keep saying you want proof, and I'm not getting you proof. What this is about is you learning to have trust and faith without needing proof. That's what your dad wants for you. And I was like, you fucking idiot. Like, come on,
If your dad knows you, then he'll know that you want evidence from him, and that you won't be satisfied with just taking something on faith without that evidence. I had one, a woman I went to, who, again, she seemed, it's difficult to say whether she was in a good moral standing of what she was doing, whether she was doing it knowingly, if it was fake. But it was just the case of, she asked me, first of all, who do you want to come through, which is alarm bells for me. But because she was persistent, I just said, my grandmother, who had died, I think, very recently, a week or 2 weeks before. And she came through all this, I've got your grandmother, but a bit too quickly for me. And she said, I've got your grandmother. She had very knobbly knuckles and very knobbly knees, and she liked to bake. And that's every person's grandmother. In my instance, it wasn't actually the case, because my nan didn't like baking at all. She was Irish, and she'd never actually done anything like that. Of course, she had knobbly knuckles and all that. And to me, it's just some of the other things she was mentioning was very, very generic, and you could apply it to anything. There's always something you could match it to. Now, to me, I wouldn't say that was evidence that she was fake. I mean, I wouldn't say it was strong enough evidence to prove that she was fake. I'd say that it just wasn't evidence to show that she was genuine. Because a lot of people had been to her and had said to me, my work colleagues had said to me, she's brilliant, she's got facts through. So I'm not going to say that she's completely fake. I'm just going to say that reading for me did not constitute evidence to suggest that she was genuine for me. And I think that's a problem, especially with the likes of the Randys, and I don't want to trash him because he passed. Certainly James Randi did a lot of good things. He did show up a lot of fakes and showed people that you really need to be careful when you're doing this sort of thing. And he did some really good work. But I think when you apply it to all mediums and you take every miss as evidence to show that they're fake, as opposed to just not evidence that they're genuine, then you're never going to be satisfied, I don't think, unless you just happen to have that one instance where it is completely and utterly impossible for any physical means that they would have known, which is increasingly more difficult to get through Facebook and social media, where any information really is accessible, which is why you've got to be careful to use, sometimes fake names, or just don't give them any information. And it's so difficult because, I'm studying psychology. Who have we got? Hi, Dan's here. Emily. Oh, nice to see you, Emily. I haven't spoken to you in a while. What was I saying?
Sorry, you were saying?
I've lost completely where I was going to go.
You were studying psychology. Give a fake name.
I'm doing a bachelor's degree in psychology, and even since before, it's clear that the majority of communication you give when you're talking to somebody is not vocal. It's what your expressions are telling them. It's your body language. It's your expressions. So, and no doubt there are a lot of cold readers who can pick up on that sort of thing. So if you're going for a mediumship reading, you have to go with an air of genuine skepticism, not debunking. I'm not going there to debunk. I'm not going there to believe. I'm not going there to debunk. I'm going there just to investigate. But you've got to take precautions to say, don't give them any of your name, don't give them any personal information about you, and you've got to be very hyper aware of what your face is doing. I mean, even something like, if they say something and you go, that's enough to tell them they've got a hit, and I can follow this road down and go a bit further. So, just if you go to a mediumship reading in the aim of investigating, you've got to be very hyper aware of what precautions you need to put into place, and to make it as scientific and as objective and empirical as possible. Because if you happen to come across a fake, they will take advantage, and they're very good at it if you don't know what to look for.
Yeah, and I'll say also in terms of facial expressions, you can do a phone reading under a fake name, Google Voice number. I've done that, and that blocks every way of cheating. And, a cold yes, no, and had some that were completely unable to function with that. And I'm not assuming they were dishonest. Sometimes, they might actually believe they're getting information. I have a personal story about that I can share. And then I've had some that just blew me away. I mean, there they are, no face, fake name, Google Voice number, and they're getting stuff. They knew my dad's name, they knew my uncle's name, they knew a sign he'd given me. I mean, so there are some that, I literally took every single precaution. I'm like, they're defying the laws of the universe and right here on this phone. And not all of them. And
a good example that I heard from a guy I interviewed called Graham, who's a induced after-death communication therapist. That's a whole other thing, but worth looking at. It's an interesting thing. But his wife is a medium, and he was telling me a very good example of what would constitute very strong evidence for genuine mediumship. Because he was telling me, right, my wife didn't know about the person that she got through, and it was his, I can't remember, it was something like his brother-in-law first removed, or some kind of relation like that they hadn't really seen much of. And, shotgun, she was bang, bang, bang facts, and obscure facts. The guy's name she'd never met, the guy's mother's name, his job, how he died. He hung himself, I believe. And one after another, and without pausing, without getting anything wrong, one after another. And that, to me, that's how you can tell a genuine medium from another, because she didn't have to fish, didn't have to ask questions. Fair enough, she was his wife, but he was very clear that she didn't know this guy at all. It's like, me trying to describe my second great aunt. I've never met her. I haven't got a clue. And that, to me, is the way that you'd want an evidential medium to be, one after another with facts. And sometimes you say it's not possible, depending on what sort of a medium they are, if they rely on symbols as opposed to hearing specific words. But obviously, his wife was one that could get that. And that is a good example of, I can't dismiss that as luck. Obviously, I'm taking it on faith that this guy is telling me the truth, but I know the guy, So, and it's things like that is constitutes to me good evidence. Got a question here. Why do you think so many mediums are women? I think I don't know. I think just biologically, women are much more in tune with emotion than men, much more intuitive than men. I suppose, I don't know if it's a difference in the brain chemistry, in the filtration system of the brain, if that's the case. But somehow, I think women are just more able to receive communication that way. Men generally are a lot more skeptically minded, or very strong emotion, very strong opinion, and a very it's not easy to convince men of opposite ideas to their own. Whereas women, it's much easier to. Women are much more humble, I think.
Do you think, you said, sorry, I just had to plug in my phone because the battery was low, so I had to reset it up. Do you think that's biological? This is a whole other discussion, not worth getting into, but I wonder if that's biological or sociological, but that's a whole other topic. I would guess it's more sociological.
Yeah, I think getting into it, very briefly, I think there must be some kind of biological component, because there's such a clear distinction between men and women's openness. Of course there is sociological implications, but because there are so many more women than men that are able to do that, that tells me that there must be a more fundamental difference biologically. I don't know. I haven't got a clue, but it could be more spiritual than biology. I don't know. But to me, I think it would make sense if there was some kind of biological mechanism there.
Yeah, I'm curious. I also wonder if you compare, that's in our culture, America, the EU, if you were to compare much more spiritual-based cultures, would that still apply?
A good point. I don't know. Because I know that the Eastern philosophies are much more open to the spiritual side of things, and men and women alike seem to believe similar things. Although it seems to be kind of an internationally recognised thing that women are generally more emotionally sensitive and more intuitive in general. I don't know how true that is, but from what I've seen just on my 25 years being here, that seems to be the case. So, we're speculating, I don't know. I'd say there seems to be some sort of biological foundation, but certainly cultural influences are very, very strong. Especially these days, men are becoming a lot more sensitive and a lot more open to their emotions. And a lot of that is social media stuff and just a change in culture. So I don't know if that means that male biology is evolving and changing, or whether it is purely social factors. It's really difficult to say.
Yeah, I think that's a whole other topic. I tend to... Yeah. And just, not really about afterlife evidence, but it's interesting. I think it would be very interesting to research, but completely different. I guess I'm curious to know, have you had, or what would you say is the most, what the fuck, what did I just see or experience moment? Is there a standout one?
Good question. Yes. When I lost Ty and Omi, my two boys, my two dogs, we lost them, and I don't want to start blubbering, but we lost them both on the same day.
On the same day, you said?
On the same day, yeah. And Ty, we knew he had liver failure, and we were expecting him to go at some point. You could see him getting worse, but Omi was perfectly healthy until we took him to the vets to get his teeth checked. And they did a preemptive kind of check over MOT, and they found that his liver, Ty had kidney failure, and that Omi's liver was completely riddled with tumours. And as things panned out, luckily we were able to have them put to sleep together at home. And they went on the same day, because if we'd only could have gone on for another 6 months, but it would have been a painful 6 months. And, both physically and emotionally, he'd been with Ty all of his life. We thought he'd want to go with him. So they went together. And after that, foxes, as a lot of people who watch my channel probably know, there's one in the corner down there. I've always liked foxes. And I said to Ty and Naomi after they passed, on the off chance, I said, come and see me and send me a fox.
Oh, did you hear that?
What was that?
You're talking about your animals, and my cat just meowed really loudly.
I didn't hear it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, anyway, and I said to them, send me a tame fox, because I'd lived in the house before where we are now. We moved this year, and I'd been in the previous house for 23 years. Never seen a fox. And I said, if you're there, send me one. Send me a tame fox, and I'll know. We went out for a walk. We started doing walks at night, me and Mum, just for a bit of exercise. And we went out at night during the snow, and I said to them, send me one of these. And as we were walking round, suddenly one shot across our path in front of us. And I thought, that's unusual. That's the first fox I've ever seen here in 23 years, but we rarely go out at night, so maybe I just missed them. Although Mum used to go out with Ty and Naomi every night. The only time we'd ever seen a fox was over the back fields where you'd expect them to be, never on the street, and this thing ran across the road. I thought, okay, fair enough. That's unusual, but I'm not going to make anything. I'm not going to get my hopes up. Another week or two later, we went back out, and I said, always thinking, if you're there, send me one. And we went out, and a second shot across a little bit closer in front of us on another road. I thought, okay, that's unusual. That's 2 foxes in 2 weeks after 23 years. But I won't think much of it. It wasn't tame. It didn't come anywhere near us. It just ran across the road. And I think it was 2 or 3 days following that, Dad came out with us. And every time Dad was with us, nothing ever happened. So I said to Ty and Naomi quietly, I said, if you can send me a fox now with Dad here, I'm not going to be able to doubt it, that you're there. And I think the third one shot out across the road closer than any of the others. I think it was 30 seconds after I thought that thought. And that time, 3 foxes in 3 weeks, after 23 years of nothing, I couldn't dismiss that any further as not evidence to their survival. And Dad, he's never believed in anything that he doesn't see with his own eyes. He's always thought that ghosts and all that sort of thing is nonsense. I'm with him on some aspects with ghosts, but that's slowly shifting as I'm seeing more. But he had an experience where me and Mum were out at the shops or somewhere, and Dad was at home with Cody, our puppy, and he was upstairs. And downstairs was a dog ball that when you press it, it squeaks. And it was quite sensitive, but you need a good squeeze to make it squeak. A fly landing on it wouldn't do it. Neither would a gust of wind rolling it across the floor. And he said this thing squeaked, and he was upstairs. And he came downstairs, and nothing was there, of course. The ball was still where it had been, it hadn't moved. And that convinced him, as strong-minded as he is, that Ty and Naomi were there visiting him. Mum's smelt them on a number of occasions. They've moved, according to Mum, they've moved the curtains when she's asked them to. And I don't know, I wasn't there. But for Dad to say something like that, I know that he saw something, and I know that he would have done what he could to debunk it, I suppose. And the foxes for me were just enough to get me really considering that they were there. So I think that's what, apart from that, I haven't seen much.
That's pretty impressive. Yeah, that's kind of, that's a good one.
I knew Emily, I know these spirits. Maybe you come on the podcast one day, we'll have a chat about it, it'd be interesting. I knew Emily from school.
Yeah.
I knew Emily, someone I know.
What?
From years ago now. Back when I was at school. I hated school.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was terrible.
You hated school? Yeah.
I think most people.
I hated school too. Hated it. Yeah. I like doing things better than sitting in classes.
I left school and I ever learned at school in terms of how to live and what's important and what's not.
Yeah. Actually, I think it'd be a good one to ask this question because I get this a lot, and this was a big thing for me in the beginning. Why I had a hard time believing this Oh, Randy, I mean, I know you asked me this too on your podcast, but so if anyone doesn't know Randy, who has since passed away, it's called The Amazing Randy, and he's a stage magician. He set up a challenge for mediums, psychics, anyone making paranormal claims. Again, not my favorite word, but that's the best word. So Randy posed a challenge that anyone who shows these abilities will win $1 million. And no one ever won. And I know for me early on, I was like, well, if no one's won the million, none of this can be true. And I've since changed my mind. But why? What are your thoughts on why no one's won the million?
From what I know, and we've got to be careful with this because there are a lot of people who are very stringently in support of him, and very vocally so. So you've just got to be careful how you tread around this subject, unfortunately. But I think I've spoken to a few people on my podcast and personally who have looked into James Randi's challenge, and just the logistics behind it, the legal stuff behind it, the fact that you have to sign all your rights over to James Randi whether you pass or not, the fact the way the challenges are set up, and I mean, one of the guys I talked to, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Lloyd Auerbach, but I'm not going to say that because I don't know for sure. Had mentioned meeting Randy, and he found out that Randy had a hidden microphone on his lapel and was recording the discussion with him. I don't know why, but of course he hadn't told him that he was doing that, and it just kind of added a little bit of incredulity to James Randi, and why would you trust that sort of thing if he does that sort of thing? I don't want to speak ill of him because he's dead, and as I say, he's done a lot of good things in terms of proper debunking of fakes, and his work does need to be respected. But in terms of a scientific approach to paranormal or parapsychological phenomena, a challenge isn't the way to do it, because science relies on, especially with this kind of area, statistical analysis, reproducing, replication, and peer review. A simple challenge won't do that. It might show a good example, but a lot of people will then say, well, Randy was clearly duped, or someone managed to cheat the system. There's a good book called Randy's Prize, which looks objectively at the process of signing up and going through the tests and qualifying or not qualifying, and all the legal stuff as to how it works. I haven't read it, but I've read it excerpts, and it's interesting. I don't know enough about the challenge to really say it's good or it's not. But from what I've seen, what I've spoken to people about, and their opinions from the professional Lloyd Auerbachs and Stanley Krippner's, most people don't regard James Randi's challenge and the fact that it wasn't passed as credible evidence against the genuineness of parapsychological phenomena. That's what I'd say, and I think that'd be fairly safe to say.
Yeah, what I'm going to add is two things. First of all, the Windbridge Institute, which studies and researches mediums, one of the things that was very important to them was to work with mediums in conditions that they say they're capable of working. That doesn't mean allow them to cheat if they're like, oh, we can only work with giving readings if we meet the person first, have their real name, and sit in a room separate with a good internet connection. I mean, nothing ridiculous. They were able to eliminate all the reasons or all the ways someone could commit fraud, or, do a cold reading, which example of a cold reading is like, reading someone's signals. For example, if you see someone, an older woman, for example, is missing a wedding ring, and you see like whiter skin and not tanned skin, and that's a very simple reason that experts are better at it. But that would be an example of cold reading, saying you've recently lost a husband. And so Windbridge said that they actually work with the mediums in how their abilities work. For example, I mean, you'd have to read one of their studies, for example, but Randy wouldn't work in how their abilities work. And the other part is no reading's flawless. And these abilities aren't flawless. So he wasn't working with the odds against chance. If you made one mistake, you didn't pass. And I mean, I'm sure all of us wish the abilities worked that way, but as mediums have said, it's more like playing charades than having a conversation with a physical person. It's interdimensional communication, which sounds so like woo, but I mean, I don't know how else to really word it. And it's not going to be flawless. Like, talking to someone on a cell phone isn't always flawless. Sitting face to face with a person, in the same dimension, bodies in the same room, you sometimes mishear each other, misinterpret. So you've got to think that it's more complicated. And so mediums get information wrong. That's why you score it with a percent. If they get my dad's name, our favorite memory, what he did for work, my grandfather's work, and then they say something completely wrong, like, oh, I have your mom here on your mom's past. No, she hasn't. I mean, it's still, they've known things that they are incapable of knowing, but then they got something wrong.
Percentage of hits versus misses as well, but how obscure the hits are and how unlikely they are to be guessable. No.
Yeah, exactly. And score it percent. Now we're kind of getting a little close to winding up, I guess. Can we open? I know a few people had put in questions along the way, but should we open it up quickly for any? Does anyone have any questions? Darren, I don't want to keep you more than 2 hours. It's almost been that. So let's do kind of the closing. Does anyone have questions? You can type it in now. Anyone still has? Okay. I'm not seeing any, but we'll give people a chance to.
Enough talking to people seeing it.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything, Darren, we'll have our final closing conversation, and if questions pop up, we'll answer them. And also you can reach out to either of us anytime on our own Instagram accounts. If anyone's not following Darren, be sure to follow him. You see his account here. You can reach out to him. You can reach out to me. We're both really friendly, nice people. We're happy to answer questions anytime.
I'll never use Instagram. It's probably best to find me on one of the links on that site.
Is there anything you think I left out? Anything you actually want to ask me? Anything you want to add?
Pretty extensively current position of these phenomena. I think it's been a good one.
Great. So we'll, for the podcast, do our proper closing. Thank you so much for being on, Darren. And if you can just tell everyone where to follow you anything you want here.
I appreciate it because you came and did a podcast on my channel as well, so we're kind of going backwards and forwards with each other's stories, which is always good. If you want to find me, just go to www.seeking-i.com. All the links to all my socials and contact information is on there on kind of a splash page. So that's the best way you can find me. Or on YouTube, just type in Seeking I and I'll come up.
Great. And thank you so much for tuning in, and really enjoyed having all of you.
Bye.
Bye.
There you go.
Okay, ended the Instagram. Let me see. 1 second. I'm just saving it to camera roll. Let me see. Trying to see where it saves on my. The only thing I'm a little concerned about. We had a really good so many people were tuning in. I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, here I'm gonna stop recording.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There, you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey-Skeptic explores grief, healing, and evidence of an afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_ or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?